At 7:42 on the night of my 40th wedding anniversary, my son turned a celebration of love into a legal ambush. In a private dining room filled with 20 of our closest friends, Thomas stood beside my chair, opened a black leather presentation folder, and asked me to sign away the rest of my life. "Dad," he said, smiling like he was doing me a kindness, "this is just a power of attorney. It's time we protected you from yourself." Beside him, my wife Margaret lowered her eyes and dabbed a perfectly dry tear with her linen napkin. And on my other side, my daughter Rebecca touched my shoulder and whispered, "Please don't make this embarrassing, Dad." Just minutes earlier, the room at Le Petit Palais had been bathed in the warm, golden glow of crystal chandeliers. The air smelled of roasted duck, expensive Cabernet, and the subtle, floral perfume Margaret had worn for 4 decades. It had been the picture of a perfect, successful American family celebrating a milestone of enduring love. But when Thomas pulled those legal papers from his briefcase and laid them on the white linen tablecloth, the illusion shattered. The lively murmurs around the mahogany table died instantly. The entire room held its breath. 20 pairs of eyes stared at me, filled with a suffocating, tragic pity. They weren't looking at a man celebrating 40 years of marriage. They weren't looking at a chief engineer anymore. They were looking at a ghost. 8 months earlier, I might have been terrified by this intervention. 8 months earlier, I might have believed they were genuinely worried about my health. 8 months earlier, I was still wondering why my car keys kept disappearing from the hook by the front door. I was still wondering why the Wi-Fi password to my own home network changed every week, locking me out of my laptop. I was still wondering why my daily heart medication mysteriously moved from the kitchen drawer to the upstairs bathroom, and then to the laundry room. I was still wondering why Margaret had started pulling our oldest friends aside at social gatherings, lowering her voice and whispering, "Arthur has good days and bad days now. We're just trying to preserve his dignity." My name is Arthur Whitmore. I am 68 years old. Before I retired, I spent 35 years as a chief structural engineer. I designed bridges that carry tens of thousands of cars across rivers every single day. I understand complex systems. I understand load-bearing pressure, tensile strength, and the exact mathematics of how things break. A structure does not collapse when a single beam fails. It collapses when every hidden support has been methodically cut, piece by piece, until the foundation simply cannot hold the weight of its own existence. My family did not start their betrayal by trying to steal my $2.5 million estate. If they had walked in with a gun and demanded the money, it would have been a crime of violence, and I could have fought back. But they were much smarter than that. They did not steal my money first. They stole my credibility. Because once a family convinces the world that an old man is confused, every truth he tells starts sounding like a symptom. The psychological conditioning, the gaslighting, began so quietly, so innocuously, that I didn't even realize I was under attack in my own home. It started on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was getting ready to drive to the hardware store. I reached for the brass hook by the front door, where I had hung my car keys every single day for 20 years. The hook was empty. I spent 20 minutes checking the pockets of my coats. I checked the kitchen counters, the dining room table, the console in the hallway. I felt the first tiny prick of frustration in the back of my mind. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen island, sipping her morning tea and reading a magazine. She watched me tear the house apart in complete silence. Finally, after I had checked the living room twice, Margaret let out a soft, patient sigh. She stood up, walked into the pantry, and opened a tin box of Earl Grey tea bags. She pulled my car keys out of the tea box. "Arthur," she said gently, walking over and placing the keys in my palm. Her eyes were wide with a deeply unsettling mixture of concern and pity. "You put them in the tea box, again." I stared at the keys in my hand. "Margaret, I didn't open the tea box this morning. I don't even drink Earl Grey." "Sweetheart," she murmured, reaching up to stroke my cheek. "You were looking for a tea bag yesterday afternoon. You must have just been distracted. It's okay. It happens to all of us as we get older. I'm just getting so worried about you." I drove to the hardware store that day feeling a cold, hollow knot in my stomach. I was a man who lived his life by exact measurements and absolute precision. The idea that my mind was betraying me was terrifying, and Margaret knew exactly how to exploit that terror. Over the next few months, the episodes escalated. Rebecca, my daughter, played her role flawlessly. Rebecca is a lifestyle influencer who spends her life on social media and uses the language of therapy to manipulate everyone around her. Every Sunday, she came over for family dinner, and every Monday morning, my laptop would refuse to connect to the Wi-Fi. I would call her, frustrated, staring at the flashing red light on my router. "Rebecca, the network is down again," I would say. "The password isn't working." There would be a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line, a pause designed to make me feel small. "Dad," Rebecca would say, her voice dripping with condescending patience. "We changed the password yesterday after dinner, remember? You said the old one was too complicated, so you asked me to simplify it to your birth year. We sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes talking about it." "No, we didn't, Rebecca," I insisted, my heart racing as I tried to search my own memory. "We talked about your new apartment, Dad." "Memory loss is nothing to be ashamed of," she whispered through the phone. "Denial is. Please, just take a deep breath. I'll text you the new password. We just want you to feel safe." She used the word safe as a weapon. She used it to build a cage around my mind. Then came Thomas. My son is a man who measures human worth exclusively in profit margins. He has expensive tastes, a struggling investment firm, and a deep-seated resentment for the slow, disciplined way I built my wealth. Thomas was in charge of managing our shared digital family calendar, a system we set up to coordinate doctors' appointments and family events. In January, I received a call from my cardiologist's office informing me that I was being charged a $200 no-show fee for missing a critical quarterly checkup. I was furious. I opened the calendar app on my phone. The appointment was gone. When I confronted Thomas about it later that week, he didn't apologize. He just chuckled, a cold, hollow sound that made my blood boil. "Dad, I didn't delete anything," Thomas said, leaning back in my leather armchair and crossing his legs. "You called me on Tuesday and told me you were rescheduling it because you felt fine. I took it off the calendar so you would get confused." "I never called you on Tuesday, Thomas," I said, my voice rising. "Dad built bridges," Thomas said, turning to his mother and ignoring me completely. He smiled, that same arrogant, infuriating smile he wore at the anniversary dinner. "I build wealth. Sometimes the old world discipline just fades away. Don't worry, Dad. I'll pay the no-show fee for you. We'll handle the logistics from now on." They never yelled at me. They never hit me. They used something infinitely more destructive: fake compassion. They built a narrative of my cognitive decline so seamlessly, so persistently, that by the time spring arrived, even I was beginning to doubt my own sanity. But the most agonizing moment, the moment the foundation of my family truly snapped, happened 2 months ago at a dinner party in my own dining room. We were hosting 3 other couples, old friends we had known since our children were in elementary school. The wine was flowing, the conversation was lively, and for a brief moment, I felt like my old self. I was midway through a conversation with my friend Richard about the tension cables on the Trinity River Bridge, explaining a highly technical flaw in the load distribution that my engineering firm had caught during the final phase of construction. I was speaking clearly. I was engaged. I was Arthur Whitmore, chief engineer. And then, Margaret placed her hand softly over mine. She squeezed my fingers, cutting me off mid-sentence. She didn't look at me. She looked across the table at Richard and his wife, her eyes wide, glistening with perfectly manufactured tragic pity. He tells that story a lot now. Margaret whispered to the table, her voice dropping into a tone of profound, exhausted sorrow. Repetition is one of the signs. Don't upset him, Richard. It makes the episodes worse when he realizes he's repeating himself. The entire table fell dead silent. The lively hum of the dinner party evaporated instantly. I looked at the faces of my oldest friends. I saw the sudden, chilling shift in their eyes. The respect was gone. The camaraderie was gone. They weren't looking at a chief engineer anymore. They were looking at a ghost. I didn't shout. I didn't flip the table. I didn't try to defend myself, because I knew that if an incapacitated man raises his voice, it is immediately dismissed as a symptom of his disease. I just sat there in the terrible, suffocating silence. I reached into my pocket, my fingers finding a small brass antique clock gear I carried for good luck. I silently turned the gear between my thumb and forefinger under the table, anchoring myself to the cold, hard reality of the metal. I am an engineer. I do not trust emotion. I trust evidence. A month after that dinner party, Margaret hired a technician to install a high-end, motion-activated security camera in the corner of my home office. She told the technician, and our children, that it was to monitor my health in case I fell out of my chair and couldn't remember how to use the phone to call for help. She was right about one thing. The camera did capture a tragedy. It just wasn't the tragedy she intended to record. 3 nights before my anniversary dinner, I couldn't sleep. The house was dead quiet. I walked downstairs in the dark, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen island. On a whim, I opened the encrypted application on my iPad to check the camera logs. I scrolled back to the previous afternoon, when Margaret thought I was taking a nap upstairs. The video feed buffered for a second, and then the color image of my home office filled the screen. My wife, my son, and my daughter were standing in the center of the room. The audio was crystal clear. "If he fights the power of attorney at the dinner," Thomas was saying, leaning casually against my heavy oak desk, "we push for a formal guardianship petition. I've already talked to the lawyers. Once Dad is placed in a care facility, Mom can liquidate the primary accounts without the emotional noise." "He won't fight," Margaret replied. I stared at the screen. Margaret's voice was entirely devoid of the gentle, worried, tragic tone she used in front of our friends. It was cold. It was sharp. It was the voice of a woman who was calculating a return on investment. "Once he signs that folder," Margaret continued, crossing her arms, "the house is ours. The accounts are ours. And Arthur can spend the rest of his confused little life somewhere quiet. By Friday, everyone in that room will already believe he's gone." "Everyone already believes it," Rebecca chimed in, scrolling through her phone without even looking up. "We've spent 8 months laying the groundwork. We just need him to look confused at dinner when Thomas pulls out the papers. He'll fold. He always folds now." I sat in my dark kitchen, the blue light of the iPad illuminating my face, listening to the people I had spent my entire life providing for discuss my disposal like I was a broken piece of furniture taking up too much space. They didn't want to care for me. They wanted to erase me while I was still breathing. I did not confront them. I did not scream. I closed the application, finished my glass of water, and walked back upstairs. The next morning, I called my attorney, Victor Hale. I opened the estate plan I had meticulously built 20 years earlier, and I moved the final, load-bearing piece into place. So when my son slid those legal papers across the white linen tablecloth at my 40th anniversary dinner, and my wife shed her fake, tragic tear in front of 20 of our closest friends, I looked at Thomas's smug, arrogant face, and I smiled. Not because I was confused, because for the first time in 8 months, every single person in that dining room was exactly where I needed them to be. When a normal man discovers that his family is actively plotting to destroy his life, his first instinct is confrontation. He kicks the bedroom door open. He screams. He demands answers. He breaks things. But I am not a normal man. I am an engineer. If you find a crack in a foundation, You do not hit it with a sledgehammer to see if it holds. You measure the depth of the fissure. You calculate the stress load. You gather your data, and then you build a temporary brace until you are ready to demolish the structure safely. I did not wake Margaret up that night. I closed the camera application on my iPad, walked back upstairs, and quietly slid into bed beside the woman who was planning to lock me in a facility so she could spend my money. I lay in the dark, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing, and I began to build my timeline. The next morning, I waited for Margaret to leave for her Tuesday morning Pilates class. The moment her Mercedes backed out of the driveway, I went to work. I didn't start with the money. I started with the mechanics of their gaslighting. I walked into my home office and logged directly into the administrative portal of my internet router. Rebecca thought I was a technologically illiterate old man who couldn't remember a password. What she didn't realize was that routers keep an internal log of every device that accesses their settings. I pulled the administrative logs for the last 8 months. There it was, in cold, undeniable black and white. Every Sunday evening, usually between 7 and 8 o'clock when the family was finishing dinner, a device registered as Rebecca's iPhone 14 Pro logged into the router's administrative page and changed the network password. She wasn't trying to simplify the password. She was deliberately cutting off my access to the outside world, creating a fabricated history of my incompetence. I exported the logs, printed them, and placed them in a heavy manila envelope. Next, I drove to my primary care physician's office in downtown Dallas. Dr. Evans had been my doctor for 15 years. I didn't make a scene in the lobby. I simply requested a physical copy of my complete medical records for the last 3 years. I sat in my car and read through them. There were notes about my blood pressure. There were notes about a minor knee surgery. There was absolutely no mention of dementia, cognitive decline, or Alzheimer's. The entire narrative was a phantom, constructed entirely of whispers Margaret had planted in the ears of our friends. But I knew that my own medical records wouldn't be enough to stop a legal guardianship petition. If Thomas and Margaret dragged me into a courtroom and testified under oath that I was suffering from severe memory loss, a judge might order a psychological hold just to be safe. I needed a preemptive strike. I needed an unimpeachable defense. At 1 o'clock that afternoon, I walked into the offices of a highly respected, independent neurologist who specialized in geriatric cognitive function. I had booked the emergency evaluation under a false name so Thomas wouldn't see the confirmation email on our shared family calendar. The neurologist, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Aris, sat across from me in a quiet, sunlit exam room. She looked at me with the polite, slightly patronizing patience that doctors reserve for the elderly. "Mr. Whitmore," Dr. Aris said, clicking her pen. "Your intake forms say you are here for a comprehensive cognitive assessment, but you have no prior history of memory issues. Can you tell me why you're here today?" "I am here, Doctor," I said calmly, "because my family is going to try to prove that my mind is gone, and I need you to prove that it is not." Dr. Aris raised an eyebrow. She had likely heard paranoid delusions from elderly patients before. She didn't argue. She just opened her assessment packet. For the next 2 hours, she put me through a grueling battery of psychological and cognitive tests. She asked me to recall lists of unrelated words. She asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. She asked me to identify the exact date, the season, and the current political climate. I answered every single question without hesitation. My mind felt sharper than it had in years. The adrenaline of betrayal has a way of clearing the fog. Finally, she placed a blank sheet of white paper and a pen on the table in front of me. "Mr. Whitmore," Dr. Aris said gently, initiating the most standard test for Alzheimer's and dementia. "I would like you to draw the face of a clock. Please put all the numbers in the correct places and draw the hands to show the time as 10 minutes past 11. I picked up the pen. I didn't just draw a circle. I used the edge of my insurance card as a straight edge to perfectly measure the distances between the numbers. I drew the hour hand pointing just past the 11, and the minute hand resting exactly on the 2. I added the internal gear ratios in the center of the dial, a habit left over from 40 years of drafting blueprints. I slid the paper back to her. Dr. Aris looked at the drawing for a long time. Then, she looked up at me. "Doctor," I said, pointing a finger toward the antique wooden grandfather clock, ticking quietly in the corner of her office. "Your clock is running exactly 4 minutes slow. The pendulum weight on the left side is hanging nearly 1/4 of an inch lower than the right, which means the escapement mechanism is unbalanced. If you don't adjust the leveling screws on the base, it's going to stop ticking entirely by next week." Dr. Aris turned her head, staring at the grandfather clock. She looked back at my drawing, and then she closed her file folder with a soft, definitive thwack. The patronizing look in her eyes was completely gone. "Mr. Whitmore," Dr. Aris said, her voice filled with a sudden deep respect, "you are not cognitively impaired. In fact, your spatial reasoning and memory retention are in the 99th percentile for your age group." "I know," I replied, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. But I needed an independent medical professional to put that in writing before my family tried to make my sanity sound like self-defense. With the certified cognitive evaluation in my briefcase, I made my final stop of the day. Victor Hale is an estate attorney who operates out of a quiet, heavily paneled office on the top floor of a high-rise in the financial district. Victor and I have been friends for 30 years. He is a man who speaks softly, bills aggressively, and hates being lied to. When I walked into his office, I didn't waste time with small talk. I dropped the manila envelope containing the router logs, my medical records, the cognitive evaluation, and a USB drive containing the video footage from the security camera onto his desk. "Arthur," Victor said, looking at the pile of evidence. "What is all this?" "This is the sound of a bridge collapsing," I said, sitting down in the leather chair across from him. "Margaret and the kids are moving against me. They're going to try to force a power of attorney, and if that fails, they're going to petition for guardianship." Victor's expression hardened. He plugged the USB drive into his computer and watched the security footage. I sat in silence, watching the reflection of the video play in Victor's glasses. I watched him listen to my wife calculate the exact timeline of my disposal. When the video ended, Victor let out a long, heavy breath. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Arthur, I am so deeply sorry," Victor whispered. "After 40 years, I never would have suspected Margaret was capable of this." "Neither did I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "But structural stress doesn't care about your feelings. It only cares about weight, and Thomas is drowning in debt. I ran a background check on his investment firm this morning. He's over-leveraged by $1 million. He needs my estate to cover his margins, and Margaret wants the lifestyle without having to deal with an aging husband." Victor nodded slowly. "If they file a guardianship petition, it will be incredibly messy. Even with this cognitive evaluation, they can freeze your assets while the court investigates the claims. If they get a temporary injunction, they can bleed your accounts dry with legal fees." "They won't get an injunction," I said, leaning forward, "because they don't own the structure. 20 years ago, when Thomas and Rebecca were just entering college, I sat in this exact office with Victor and built my estate plan. I didn't just write a simple will. As an engineer, I knew that wealth is fragile unless it is anchored correctly. I had established a revocable living trust. For 2 decades, I was the primary trustee, which meant I had total control over the assets. Margaret was listed as the primary beneficiary upon my death, and Thomas and Rebecca were the contingent beneficiaries. But buried deep in the legal framework of that trust was a specific load-bearing clause. Victor and I had drafted that clause 20 years earlier, signed it, notarized it, and left it dormant for exactly this kind of emergency. "Victor," I said, "I want to trigger the irrevocable conversion clause." Victor's eyes widened. "Arthur, if you convert the trust to an irrevocable status, you are locking the assets. You can't change your mind later. The house, the investment portfolios, the cabin, everything will be legally transferred into a separate entity. It will be untouchable." "That is exactly the point," I said. "I want to resign as the primary trustee, effective immediately. I am naming you as the independent third-party trustee, and I want to execute a full beneficiary reassignment. Remove Margaret, remove Thomas, remove Rebecca, cut them out entirely." Victor typed furiously on his keyboard, pulling up my estate files. "If I file this conversion today, Margaret loses all legal authority over the assets. If Thomas tries to use a power of attorney, it will be absolutely worthless, because you technically no longer own the money. The trust owns it, and he can't touch the trust." "What about the house?" I asked. "The deed to the house is already in the name of the trust," Victor explained, his legal mind moving at lightning speed. "Margaret only has the right to live there as a spouse in good standing. The moment you file for divorce, and we present this evidence of elder abuse, she loses her residency rights. The trust can formally evict her." "Do it," I commanded. Victor paused, his hands hovering over the keyboard. He looked at me, searching my face for any sign of hesitation, any sign of the grief that should have been tearing me apart. "Arthur," Victor said softly, "once I hit submit on these filings, there is no going back. This is the nuclear option. Your family will be completely severed from your wealth by tomorrow morning." I looked out the massive window of Victor's office, watching the tiny cars move across the bridges I had built decades ago. I thought about the way Margaret looked at me with that fake, tragic pity. I thought about Thomas laughing at my discipline. I thought about Rebecca telling me that my memory loss was nothing to be ashamed of. "They spent 8 months trying to make me forget who I was," I said, turning back to Victor. "It's time I reminded them." Victor hit the key. The conversion was filed. The foundation of my family was officially cut. Thomas thought he was going to ask me to sign over my money at the anniversary dinner. What he did not know was that, by then, the money no longer legally belonged to me. 3 days later, I put on a tailored tuxedo and drove to Le Petit Palais to celebrate my 40th wedding anniversary. And as Thomas slid that leather folder across the table, asking me to sign away my life, I didn't feel angry. I felt the deep, profound peace of a man who knows exactly how the bridge is going to fall. The private dining room at Le Petit Palais was not chosen by accident. Margaret had spent 3 weeks meticulously planning the logistics of our 40th wedding anniversary. She had selected a room with heavily insulated walls, ensuring that no outside patrons would interrupt the evening. She had ordered a preset menu, so there would be no confusing decisions for me to make in front of the waitstaff. She had arranged the floral centerpieces so they were low enough to allow everyone at the long mahogany table an unobstructed view of my face. But most importantly, she had carefully curated the guest list. This was not a celebration of 4 decades of marriage. It was an intervention, and an intervention requires an audience. Sitting to my immediate left was Margaret, wearing a stunning black cashmere dress and her signature pearl necklace. She looked elegant, timeless, and completely devoted. Sitting across from us were Thomas and Rebecca. But the remaining 16 seats were the real weapons. Margaret had invited my oldest brother, David, who had flown in from Chicago. She had invited our longtime financial advisor. She had invited Dr. Sterling, a retired physician who we played golf with at the country club. She had even invited Pastor Miller from our local congregation. Margaret had filled the room with people of high social and moral standing. People whose credibility would be unquestionable when they were inevitably called upon to testify that Arthur Whitmore was no longer capable of managing his own life. The evening began with a masterclass in psychological manipulation. As the first course was served, Margaret stood up and tapped her crystal wine glass with a silver fork. The quiet hum of conversation died down instantly. Margaret smiled, placing one hand softly on my shoulder while she addressed the room. 40 years, Margaret said, her voice rich with a practiced melodic warmth. When Arthur and I stood at the altar 4 decades ago, we promised to love each other for better or for worse, in sickness and in health. And I think anyone who has been married, as long as we have, knows that the sickness part of those vows isn't just about physical health. She paused, letting her eyes drift across the faces of our guests. I watched David nod sympathetically. I saw Pastor Miller offer a soft, understanding smile. It's about the mind, too, Margaret continued, her voice dropping into a register of profound vulnerability. Tonight is about love, it is about patience, and it is about accepting the changing seasons of a marriage. Arthur has been the foundation of this family for his entire life. He has carried the weight for all of us. But even the strongest foundations need to rest eventually, and when they do, it is our job, our privilege, to step up and carry the weight for him. The room erupted into gentle, supportive applause. Margaret looked down at me, her eyes glistening with fake tears, and kissed the top of my head. "I love you, Arthur," she whispered. "Thank you, Margaret," I replied. My voice was perfectly steady. I didn't pull away from her kiss. I didn't glare at her. I just took a sip of my Cabernet and waited. When the main course was cleared, it was Rebecca's turn to tighten the noose. Everyone. "If I could just get your attention to the screen at the back of the room," Rebecca announced, standing up and waving a small remote control. She had set up a projector before the dinner began. I put together a little slideshow, just a few memories to celebrate Mom and Dad. The lights in the private dining room dimmed. The projector hummed to life, casting a bright square of light onto the far wall. The first few minutes of the slideshow were exactly what you would expect. Photos from our wedding day in 1986. Photos of Margaret and me holding Thomas and Rebecca as infants. Photos of family vacations to the Grand Canyon and Hawaii. But as the slideshow progressed into the last 3 years, the tone of the photographs subtly shifted. Rebecca had combed through hundreds of recent pictures and selected only the ones that fit their narrative. There was a photo of me sitting in my armchair in the living room, completely asleep, my mouth slightly open. There was a photo of me at a Christmas party, caught in a candid moment where I was staring blankly at a wall, looking lost and disconnected from the crowd around me. There was a video clip of me walking through the garden, moving slowly, leaning heavily on a rake as if I couldn't remember what I was doing. She didn't show the pictures of me building a new deck in the backyard. She didn't show the video of me helping Thomas fix the alternator in his luxury SUV just 6 months ago. She only showed the decay. As the final photograph faded from the screen, a picture of Margaret holding my hand in a hospital waiting room after my minor knee surgery, carefully cropped to look like she was comforting a dying man. The lights in the dining room slowly came back up. The silence in the room was heavy. It wasn't the joyful silence of nostalgia. It was the uncomfortable, somber silence of a wake. My brother David looked at me, his eyes filled with a heartbreaking mixture of pity and fear. They were building the narrative right in front of my eyes, and it was working perfectly. Then, the final beam was cut. Thomas stood up. He buttoned the center button of his expensive, custom-tailored Italian suit. He didn't look at the guests, he looked directly at me. "Dad," Thomas said, his voice deep and resonant. He projected a commanding, masculine authority designed to assure the older men in the room that he was ready to take over the role of patriarch. "You taught me everything I know about responsibility. You taught me how to work hard, how to provide, and how to protect the people I love." Thomas walked slowly around the edge of the large mahogany table until he was standing right beside my chair. "You spent 35 years building bridges so other people could travel safely," Thomas continued, placing his hand firmly on the back of my chair. "You never asked for help. You never complained. But the time has come for you to cross a bridge of your own, and it's our turn to build it for you." He looked around the room, making eye contact with the financial advisor and the doctor. "It's our turn to be responsible for you, Dad," Thomas said. The guests began to clap. It started slowly, but quickly built into a round of warm, emotional applause. Several people raised their wine glasses toward Thomas. Margaret wiped her eyes again. Rebecca nodded vigorously, her hands clasped under her chin. As the applause died down, Thomas reached down into the leather briefcase resting against the leg of the table. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The sentimental warmth evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sharp tension. The guests leaned forward in their chairs. They didn't know exactly what was happening, but they knew a transaction was taking place. Thomas pulled out a thick, black leather presentation folder. He opened it and laid it on the white tablecloth directly in front of my empty dessert plate. Inside the folder was a stack of legal documents, printed on heavy bond paper. A silver Mont Blanc pen was clipped to the inside pocket. "Dad," Thomas said, lowering his voice so it sounded gentle, almost soothing, but I could see the cold, frantic greed burning behind his eyes. "This is just a signature. It lets us help." I looked down at the documents. The bold, capitalized letters at the top of the first page read, "Asterisk durable power of attorney for property and finances." Asterisk if I signed that paper, Thomas would have immediate, unchecked legal authority to access my bank accounts, liquidate my investment portfolios, sell my real estate, and make binding financial decisions on my behalf. If I signed that paper, I would become a legal ghost in my own life. I didn't reach for the pen. I didn't look at the documents. I just sat perfectly still, my hands resting on my lap. "Help with what, Thomas?" I asked quietly. My voice was not angry. It did not tremble. It was the calm, measured voice of a chief engineer asking a junior architect to explain a flawed blueprint. Thomas smiled patiently, glancing briefly at the guests to ensure they were watching my confusion. "With the logistics, Dad," Thomas explained, gesturing to the papers. "With the decisions you're no longer able to make safely. Managing the accounts, paying the property taxes, handling the medical bills. It's too much stress for you right now. We just want you to rest." "He's right, Arthur," Margaret whispered, leaning close to me. She placed her hand over mine, her manicured nails digging slightly into my skin. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, it was a physical warning. "Please don't make this hard. You know how confused you get when you try to handle the bank statements. We're doing this because we love you. We're trying to protect you." From across the table, Rebecca chimed in, her voice dripping with therapeutic condescension. "Dad, denial is part of the decline," Rebecca said softly, looking at me with wide, sympathetic eyes. "There is no shame in admitting you need help. But if you fight us on this, it's only going to make things worse for everyone. Please, just sign the paper so we can enjoy the rest of the evening." The trap was fully sprung. If I yelled, I was an agitated dementia patient throwing a tantrum. If I refused to sign and stormed out, I was a confused, paranoid old man rejecting the help of his loving family. And if I signed the paper, I surrendered my entire life to a son who wanted to liquidate my wealth to cover his bad investments. They had engineered a situation where every possible emotional reaction would only confirm their narrative. So, I gave them the only reaction they hadn't planned for. I smiled. I looked at Margaret's hand resting on top of mine. I looked at Rebecca's fake, pleading eyes. I looked at the power of attorney sitting on the table. And then I looked directly into Thomas's smug, arrogant face. "Protect me," I repeated, letting the words hang in the silent air of the dining room. I slowly pulled my hand out from under Margaret's grip. I reached out and tapped my index finger against the heavy black leather folder. "That is exactly what I wanted recorded," I said softly. Thomas frowned. The smug confidence on his face faltered for a fraction of a second. "Recorded? Dad, what are you talking about? Nobody is recording anything. Just take the pen." "I am not talking to you, Thomas," I said. leaning back in my chair. At that exact moment, the heavy brass handle on the double doors of the private dining room turned with a loud metallic click. Every head at the mahogany table snapped toward the entrance. The doors swung open. Standing in the threshold was Victor Hale. My attorney was wearing a sharp charcoal gray suit. In his left hand, he held my iPad. In his right hand, he held a thick manila envelope sealed with a red legal stamp. Victor did not look at the guests. He did not look at me. He locked his eyes entirely on Margaret and Thomas. "Good evening, everyone," Victor said, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers with the booming authority of a seasoned litigator. He walked into the room, letting the heavy doors swing shut behind him. Margaret let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her chest. Thomas took a step back from the table, his face draining of color, as he recognized the man who had drafted my original estate plan 20 years ago. The flawless foundation of their gaslighting had just sustained its first catastrophic fracture, and I was ready to bring the entire structure down. The heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room swung shut, sealing all 20 of us inside. The warm, sentimental atmosphere that Margaret had spent 3 weeks carefully curating vanished instantly, replaced by a suffocating, electrifying tension. Victor Hale did not look like a man arriving to celebrate a 40th wedding anniversary. He looked like an executioner who had just clocked in for his shift. He walked past the stunned faces of my older brother David, Pastor Miller, and the financial advisor. He didn't offer a polite smile. He didn't offer an apology for the interruption. He walked directly to the small AV cart at the back of the room where my daughter Rebecca had set up her laptop for the slideshow. Without a word, Victor reached down, unplugged the HDMI cable from Rebecca's computer, and plugged it directly into the iPad he had brought with him. "Hey, excuse me," Thomas snapped, breaking the silence. He stepped away from my chair, his face flushed with sudden anger. "This is a private family event. You can't just barge in here, Dad. Tell your lawyer to leave." I didn't look at Thomas. I kept my eyes fixed on the blank projector screen on the far wall. "Victor isn't here as my guest, Thomas," I said, my voice cutting through the tension with absolute clarity. "He is here in his legal capacity as the independent trustee of the Whitmore family estate. And he is going to show you exactly why." Victor tapped the screen of the iPad. The projector hummed, and the bright square of light on the wall shifted. It wasn't a slideshow of happy memories. It was a security camera feed. Specifically, the feed from the high-end, motion-activated camera Margaret had installed in my home office 2 months ago to monitor my safety. The video on the wall showed the 3 of them, Margaret, Thomas, and Rebecca, standing in my office just 3 days ago. The image was razor-sharp, and the audio echoed through the quiet dining room with devastating clarity. "If he fights the power of attorney at the dinner," Thomas's voice boomed from the projector speakers, his larger-than-life projection casually leaning against my oak desk. "We push for a formal guardianship petition. I've already talked to the lawyers. Once Dad is placed in a care facility, Mom can liquidate the primary accounts without the emotional noise." The collective gasp from the 20 guests at the table was audible. My brother David physically recoiled, his eyes wide with shock. Pastor Miller looked down at his plate, his face turning pale. The financial advisor stared at Thomas, his jaw slightly open. The video continued. "He won't fight." Margaret's recorded voice answered. It wasn't the gentle, weeping voice she had used just 5 minutes ago. It was the voice of a cold, calculating predator. "Once he signs that folder, the house is ours. The accounts are ours, and Arthur can spend the rest of his confused little life somewhere quiet. By Friday, everyone in that room will already believe he's gone." "Everyone already believes it," Rebecca's voice added, her projection scrolling through her phone. "We've spent 8 months laying the groundwork. We just need him to look confused at dinner when Thomas pulls out the papers. He'll fold. He always folds now." Victor tapped the iPad. The screen went black. The silence that followed was not the quiet of respect or the quiet of pity. It was the terrifying absolute silence of total exposure. The mask had been ripped off, and the ugly, decaying truth of my family was suddenly displayed for 20 of the most respected people in our social circle to see. Margaret's face was chalk white. She looked like a woman who had just stepped off a cliff and realized the ground was entirely gone. But a lifetime of manipulation doesn't just switch off. Margaret took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes filling with fresh, panicked tears. She lunged across the table and grabbed my hand. "Arthur, sweetheart," Margaret cried, her voice trembling violently. "You're misunderstanding what you heard. The context is all wrong. We were talking about what would happen if your condition worsened. We were terrified for you. We were just trying to find a way to keep you safe." I looked down at her hands gripping mine. I didn't pull away. I just looked at her with the cold, analytical detachment of an engineer inspecting a failed piece of machinery. "For 8 months, Margaret," I said softly, my words carrying to every corner of the silent room, "you trained everyone in this room to believe that exact sentence before I ever played the recording. You trained them to believe that any truth I tell is just a symptom of my decline. You didn't just try to steal my money. You tried to bury me alive inside my own mind." Thomas slammed his hand down on the mahogany table. The silverware rattled against the plates. "This is illegal," Thomas shouted, his face turning a dark, mottled red. He pointed a trembling finger at Victor. "You can't record people in their own home without their consent. Texas is a one-party consent state, but Dad wasn't even in the room. This is wiretapping. This is completely inadmissible in any court." Victor Hale stepped forward, the red-stamped manila envelope resting in his hand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The recordings," Victor said, his voice dripping with legal authority, "were captured by a security system explicitly installed by Mrs. Whitmore, in a home that Mr. Whitmore legally owns. The footage was preserved after Mr. Whitmore discovered evidence of organized financial exploitation and elder abuse. We are more than happy to discuss the nuance of admissibility with a district judge, Thomas." Victor paused, looking directly into Thomas's panicked eyes. "But tonight," Victor continued, "we are not discussing admissibility. We are discussing honesty. And the truth is, your entire guardianship strategy relied on presenting your father as an incapacitated, confused old man. Which brings us to Exhibit B." Victor opened the red-stamped envelope. He pulled out a thick stack of medical documents and tossed them onto the center of the dining table, right next to Thomas's useless power of attorney folder. On Tuesday afternoon, Mr. Whitmore sat for a comprehensive, 3-hour independent cognitive evaluation by one of the top geriatric neurologists in Dallas, Victor announced to the room. He scored in the 99th percentile for spatial reasoning, memory retention, and cognitive function. He is sharper than most 40-year-old men. There is absolutely no medical basis for a guardianship petition, and any attempt to file one will be met with a countersuit for malicious prosecution. Margaret let out a sharp, choked sob. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. But nobody at the table reached out to comfort her. My brother David was glaring at her with a look of absolute disgust. Rebecca was frozen in her chair. The lifestyle influencer, the woman who had spent months using the language of therapy to gaslight me about Wi-Fi passwords, had completely lost her ability to speak. Furthermore, Victor continued, delivering the final, crushing blow to their financial ambitions. As of 8 o'clock yesterday morning, the revocable living trust established by Mr. Whitmore 20 years ago has been legally converted into an irrevocable family protection trust. Thomas physically stumbled backward, leaning heavily against the wall. The color drained from his face entirely. As a finance broker, he knew exactly what that meant. "I have been appointed as the independent trustee," Victor stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "The $2.5 million estate, including the primary residence, the investment portfolios, and all liquid assets, are now permanently locked inside that trust. Thomas, you and Rebecca have been entirely removed as contingent beneficiaries. You will not inherit a single dime of Mr. Whitmore's wealth. Victor turned to Margaret. And Margaret, Victor said coldly, your access to all joint financial accounts has been frozen, pending a forensic audit. Because the deed to the house is held by the trust, your residency is strictly conditional upon your status as a spouse in good standing. I reached into my suit jacket. I pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. I placed it on the table, right on top of Thomas's power of attorney. And as of 3 hours ago, I said, looking into my wife's horrified eyes, you are no longer in good standing. Margaret stared at the paper. It was a formal petition for divorce, citing extreme psychological cruelty and financial abuse. The carefully constructed mask Margaret had worn for 40 years finally shattered. The weeping, vulnerable, devoted wife vanished. She stood up, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. After 40 years, Margaret screamed, her voice cracking with fury. After 40 years of cooking your meals, hosting your friends, and standing by your side while you worked 80-hour weeks, you would humiliate me like this? You would invite all these people here just to destroy me in public? I looked up at the woman I had loved for most of my life. I felt a profound, heavy sadness in my chest, but I did not feel regret. No, Margaret, I said softly, the silence of the room amplifying every word. After 40 years, you chose an audience. I simply chose evidence. The heavy double doors of the private dining room opened again. The maitre d' stepped inside, looking extremely uncomfortable. He was holding a small, black leather checkbook presenter. He looked around the silent, tension-filled room, clearly realizing he had interrupted a catastrophe, but he had a job to do. I apologize for the intrusion, the maitre d' stammered, walking tentatively toward the table. But the kitchen needs to close out the tab for the private room. The total for the preset menu and the wine pairings is $4,200. He held the leather presenter out toward Thomas, who was standing closest to the door. Thomas swallowed hard. He looked at the bill, then looked at me, a nervous, desperate smile twitching at the corners of his mouth. Just put it on my dad's account, Thomas said, his voice tight. He always handles the anniversary dinners. Before the maitre could take a step toward me, Victor Hale raised his hand. I'm sorry, Victor said, his tone utterly polite but completely unyielding. Mr. Whitmore's accounts are no longer available for family charges. The trust has placed a hard freeze on all non-essential expenditures. Thomas stared at Victor, his eyes wide with panic. He looked at Margaret. Margaret looked away. He looked at Rebecca, who was staring blankly at the tablecloth. This was a finance broker drowning in margin debt. He didn't have $4,000 in his checking account. I stood up from the table. I buttoned my suit jacket and adjusted my tie. I looked at the 20 guests, my brother, the doctor, the pastor, the friends who had pitied me just 20 minutes ago. I didn't need to explain myself to them anymore. The video had done it for me. I turned to my son, who was standing near the door, holding the massive dinner bill in his trembling hand. You spent 8 months trying to make me look confused, Thomas, I said, walking past him toward the exit. Tonight, I decided to let you explain the bill. I walked out of the private dining room, and Victor Hale followed right behind me. As the heavy mahogany doors swung shut, sealing my family inside with the wreckage of their own greed, I didn't hear a single voice rise to defend them. I only heard the terrifying, absolute silence of a structure that had finally permanently collapsed. The destruction of a false narrative is a violently rapid process. When you spend 8 months building a structural lie, it only takes one undeniable piece of evidence to bring the entire facade crashing down into dust. By 9 o'clock the morning after the anniversary dinner, The social and financial collapse of my family was already well underway. I did not have to actively destroy their reputations. They had done that to themselves by inviting 20 of our most respected peers to witness their crime. News travels fast in wealthy, insulated circles, and the story of what happened in the private dining room at Le Petit Palais spread through our country club like a wildfire fueled by pure scandal. Rebecca was the first to feel the impact. She had built her entire lifestyle influencer brand on the aesthetic of mindfulness, family, and therapeutic healing. But by noon on Thursday, a detailed count of the dinner, complete with quotes from the hidden camera footage, had been anonymously leaked to a local gossip blog, presumably by someone who had been sitting at the mahogany table. Within 48 hours, 3 of Rebecca's primary corporate sponsors dropped her. The comment sections on her carefully curated photos were flooded with people calling her a sociopath. She posted a tearful, 3-minute apology video claiming her words were taken out of context. But it only made things worse. You cannot use the language of therapy to explain away a recorded plot to lock your own father in a memory care facility. The top comment under her apology video was simply, "Denial is nothing to be ashamed of, Rebecca." Her digital empire crumbled, built on a foundation as fragile as her morality. Thomas's downfall was much quieter, but infinitely more devastating. Victor Hale did not just lock my assets inside the irrevocable Family Protection Trust. As my attorney, he had a legal obligation to report suspected elder financial abuse. On Friday morning, Victor forwarded the security camera audio, along with Thomas's emails detailing his plan to liquidate the accounts, directly to the compliance department of Thomas's investment firm. In the financial industry, attempting to defraud a vulnerable family member is a career death sentence. Thomas was suspended without pay pending a full internal investigation, without access to his salary, and completely cut off from my estate. Thomas could no longer cover the massive margin calls on his failing investments. By the end of the month, he was forced to put his luxury SUV and his downtown condo on the market just to avoid bankruptcy. He built wealth, as he loved to say, but he forgot that wealth requires an anchor. And then there was Margaret. The woman I had loved for 40 years did not go quietly. She hired a vicious, high-priced divorce attorney and attempted to file an emergency injunction to unfreeze our joint accounts. She claimed that my cognitive evaluation was faked, that Victor Hale had manipulated me, and that I was suffering from extreme paranoia. But her attorney was fighting a ghost. The money was no longer legally mine. It belonged to the trust, and the independent cognitive evaluation from Dr. Aris was an impenetrable shield. A family court judge took one look at the security camera transcript, threw out Margaret's injunction, and granted my petition for an absolute financial freeze pending the finalization of the divorce. 2 weeks later, Victor Hale formally served Margaret with an eviction notice. The deed to our 5-bedroom, custom-built mansion was held by the trust. Because Margaret was no longer a spouse in good standing, she had 30 days to vacate the premises. The woman who had tried to throw me out of my own life was now being legally escorted out of hers. She lost her home. She lost her limitless credit cards. But most painfully for Margaret, she lost her audience. The women she used to drink wine with, the friends she used to whisper to about my tragic decline, refused to answer her phone calls. She had tried to make me an object of pity, and in the end, she had become an object of pure disgust. I did not stay in the Dallas mansion to watch her pack. I had no desire to gloat, and I had no desire to watch 40 years of marriage be packed into cardboard boxes. Instead, I drove 300 miles east to a quiet, secluded cabin I owned on the shores of Lake Caddo. It was a small, rustic property surrounded by towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. I had bought it 10 years ago, intending to fix it up so Margaret and I could retire there. She had always hated it. She said the silence was too loud and the isolation was too depressing. But for me, The silence was the most beautiful sound in the world. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 month after the anniversary dinner, I was sitting at a heavy oak workbench on the enclosed back porch of the cabin. I was wearing an old flannel shirt, holding a magnifying glass to my eye, and using a pair of precision tweezers to carefully adjust the mainspring of an antique brass clock. My cell phone, resting on the corner of the workbench, buzzed. I set the tweezers down and looked at the screen. It was a voicemail from Thomas. He had been calling me once a week since the dinner, leaving desperate, rambling messages. I tapped the screen and put the phone on speaker. "Dad?" Thomas's voice echoed through the quiet porch. He didn't sound like the arrogant finance broker anymore. He sounded exhausted, terrified, and small. "Dad, please pick up. I lost the condo today. The firm fired me. I know what I did was wrong. I was just under so much pressure, and Mom convinced us that you were actually losing your mind. I didn't think it would go this far. Please, Dad, I need your help." I sat in the quiet cabin, listening to the sound of the rain hitting the tin roof. I didn't feel a surge of vindictive joy. I didn't smile. I just felt a profound, heavy sorrow. I reached out, tapped the screen, and forwarded the voicemail directly to Victor Hale to be added to the legal file. Then I blocked Thomas's number. A few minutes later, the phone buzzed again. This time it was Victor. "Arthur," Victor said, his voice warm and steady. "I just received the audio file. I'll add it to the discovery packet. I also wanted to let you know that the movers have officially finished clearing Margaret's belongings out of the Dallas property. The locks have been changed, and the security system has been reset. The house is completely secure." "Thank you, Victor," I replied, staring out at the gray, misty water of the lake. There was a brief pause on the line. "Arthur," Victor asked softly, "I know this has been a brutal month. Do you have any regrets? Do you regret doing it so publicly at the dinner?" I picked up the small brass clock gear from my workbench and turned it slowly between my fingers. "They made my mind a public question, Victor," I said calmly. "I simply gave it a public answer. If I had confronted them in private, they would have twisted it. They would have told everyone that I was having a paranoid episode. They would have used my anger as evidence of my decline. The only way to destroy a lie that big is to blow it up in front of an audience." "You did what you had to do to survive," Victor agreed. "Take care of yourself, Arthur. Call me if you need anything." I ended the call and set the phone face down on the table. I picked up my precision tools and went back to work on the antique clock. For 8 months, my family had moved my keys, changed my passwords, hid my medicine, and called it love. They had tried to convince me that my own mind was a failing structure, hoping that I would eventually collapse under the weight of my own self-doubt. But love does not need a man to look broken before it can inherit him. True love reinforces a foundation. It doesn't drill holes in the concrete while you sleep. I carefully lowered the small brass gear into the heart of the escapement mechanism. I tightened the tiny retaining screw, applied a single drop of oil to the pivot point, and gently nudged the pendulum. The brass wheel caught. The spring engaged. Tick! Tick! The clock on my workbench came back to life at exactly 9:17 in the morning. I sat back in my chair, listening to the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the metal gears. I listened to the rain falling on the roof. I listened to the wind blowing through the cypress trees. And for the first time in almost a year, every single sound in my house belonged to me. Before I go, I want to ask you a question. Was Arthur cruel for exposing his family in front of everyone at the anniversary dinner? Some people believe that family matters should always be handled privately, and that ambushing his wife and children in front of their oldest friends was an act of unnecessary vengeance. They argue that public humiliation is never the right answer, even when you've been betrayed. But others believe that Arthur had no other choice. When a family spends 8 months building a public lie about your sanity, the only way to destroy it is to blow it up in front of an audience. Was public humiliation the only way to survive a public lie? Or would you have confronted them privately? Let me know what you honestly think down in the comments. I read every single one, and I know this is a subject people feel very strongly about. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you on the next one.